Hello and welcome to another Thursday interview here on Viking.TV. And this week, as you probably know by now, is Greece Week. And my guest today is someone whose love for Greece has inspired her to write best-selling novels. She's sold something like 7 million of them. In fact, that was the last time I checked. It's probably gone up since then. They are stories of passion and emotion set against a backdrop of troubled times. But you'll be pleased to hear, if you don't already know her work, she believes in happy endings. Once a teenage tourist, it was a case of love at first sight when she fell for the country, set her stories there, and, if you like, put modern Greece on the world map. Well, that was the phrase used by the country's president when last year he gave her citizenship and a Greek passport as a thank you for all the work she does promoting modern Greek history and culture. Her first book, The Island, shot to the top of the bestsellers charts. She followed that debut with more novels, all of which fly off the shelves as soon as they're written, and they've turned her into a literary superstar. And today sees the publication of the paperback version of One August Night, another story about the island. Such is her love of Greece and its islands. She divides her time between homes in the UK, Athens and Crete. Who can blame her? And she has actually learned the language. So welcome now to best-selling writer Victoria Hislop. Hello, Victoria.
Hello, Anne. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Which
all of it's true. How many books is it now, actually?
Dreamy. Well, I think probably 10 million, nearer 10 million now. Yeah, and I'm very lucky because what's really intrigued me ever since I started writing is how people in so many different corners of the world can connect with a story. And you might never meet most of your readers, you'll never meet them, but I have a big fan base, strangely enough, in China. And, you know, I just love the idea that stories kind of fly, and they obviously, for some reason, touch readers from a completely different culture from our own, people who will probably never ever manage to get to Greece. And that's, I don't know, some very gratifying feeling as an author.
I think reassuring that even if we come from very different cultures, there is something that, you know, about just being human that connects us, and never have we probably thought about it more than in the last year. How has the pandemic been for you? How has it affected Greece?
Well, obviously in Greece, one of the pillars of their kind of economy is tourism. So it has been very difficult here. You know, a lot of hotels are not as full as they are normally. Restaurants are suffering. So, yeah, I mean, it's been economically extremely difficult for a lot of Greek families that I know personally. But they're very optimistic. You know, they're looking forward to any Brit that they see is welcome with even more open arms than normal. So I think, you know, we've had quite a few cruise ships coming in the last week or so. I've just been noticing those because I can see the port from where I'm sitting now. And there's always great excitement, you know, there's a cruise ship coming, and then the shops are all, you know, polishing all the souvenirs, hoping everybody will come in and purchase. So yes, it's not been, I think every country has suffered in a different way, but obviously tourism is, you know, such an important thing in Greece. So yeah, fingers crossed it's going to improve.
Well, without giving away your privacy, where are you now? Exactly where? And I mean, obviously you're in Greece because I can see the statue behind you.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I could have imported her, but she is quite authentic, isn't she? I'm very specifically, if I look over to my right, there's a sort of big lump of rock on the horizon, and just behind it is Spinalonga, which is the island of the book title. And our house is about 20 minutes away from Spinalonga along the coast near Ios. So, you know, I'm very lucky. I managed to get here in March of this year because I had a TV series adaptation from one of my books happening, and I just wanted to be part of that. And of course, it hasn't been that easy to go back to the UK. So I've had a rather a blissful 4 months looking at the Aegean. So, you know, I feel immensely lucky, although I know there's a heat wave in the UK at the moment. But
yeah, but I can't look out and see the Aegean. It's not quite the same. Who is the lovely lady behind you? What's her story?
Well, this is Aphrodite, who of course is the goddess of love. That's the Greek name for Venus, which is a wonderful kind of bit of serendipity. And she arrived here last week. She looks quite old, doesn't she? But she's a newcomer in my house, and she has an actually very touching story. I wrote an episode. It was adapted. An episode of this new series, which we've just made, is adapted from a short story of mine about an elderly man who is digging in his garden one day, and he suddenly realizes that as he's digging, he's revealing this beautiful, smooth marble body, and he literally falls in love with this statue. And at the same time, his wife, who the statue is specifically designed to look like his wife has withdrawn from him in every way. She's kind of suffering from some kind of psychological depression. So as he uncovers this statue, she reminds him so much of how his wife was when she was younger, that it totally sort of revives him. So we actually, for the TV series, we had to build the statue that's then lifted out of the ground, and in the final episode we see Aphrodite here in the museum, which was actually the real museum in Ios Nikolaos. She was there and we filmed there. And then when the scene had finished, the shoot, they said, what are we going to do with this prop? I mean, basically she's a prop. Yeah. And I said, can she come and live in my house? And here she is. So it's a lovely big souvenir.
Oh, she's a lovely, she really is. She's beautiful. So it's nice. It's interesting you talking about how you can fall in love with a place, statue or something like that, because that's what happened to you, isn't it? You fell in love with Greece.
I really did, Anne. Yes. I mean, it was my first visit here as a teenager. And I'm not surprised that I fell in love with the place, because more or less up until when I was 16 years old, we went on holiday mostly to very cold, drafty seaside places in the UK. We were always finding ourselves in, Bognor Regis, and I don't want to diss Bognor Regis because it's a lovely place. But actually the contrast between sitting on a beach in Bognor, swimming in the sea in Bognor, eating, I'm talking the 1960s, 1969 Bognor Regis cuisine was not of the haute. I'm sure there are lovely restaurants there now, but we had, pretty normal type of 1960s food. So when my parents separated when I was a teenager, and one of the sort of very transformative and positive things about that happening was that my mother started earning her own living. And for her, a priority was to take herself, me and my sister, to the Mediterranean for a holiday. Because, of course, by the mid-1970s, more people were travelling, the package holiday had been invented. So one summer she brought us to Greece, and we went to Paros, the island. And I mean, I really thought I'd arrived in heaven. I mean, I can't think of another word that's better for it, because everything was blue. The sea was blue, the sky was blue. It was just, and the Greek flag itself, which is that lovely, fresh blue and white. And I realised how much I love that colour. If it boils down to anything, it's the colour blue. And when I actually look at, some of my book covers, they're all blue. Everything is blue. And I find it a very uplifting place. That's the key. The key things is it really uplifts me, Greece.
I was going to say you were a pretty ordinary schoolgirl, but you weren't, because you got a place at Oxford. What did you read at Oxford? Was it English Lit?
Yes, it was. I read English Lit, and I had a couple of options to do a little bit of French, and I did a Latin paper as well. So I was always slightly trying to to break out of English a little bit, because actually languages have been my passion. You know, I loved French and Spanish and German at school, but I had a very charismatic English teacher, and you know, she slightly, you know, directed me towards English, which I don't regret, because that's probably how I met Ian. He was reading English literature at Oxford in the same year. So, you know, you can't change your own history, can you? And without having read English, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now talking to you. Do you know what I mean? One of those little paths. I met Ian. We've been married, you know, for more years, I think 33 years. We met 40 years ago in the library at Oxford, reading the same English literature books. So, you know, that was destiny.
Well, it was destiny, yeah. And you've been married for a very long time now. I know one of our viewers has already sent in a question saying, when did you meet Ian? And just for the sake of anyone watching at the moment who doesn't know who we're talking about your husband, Ian Hislop, who's very, very well known in Britain and beyond as a very famous broadcaster and editor of Private Eye, of course. But we'll talk more about him later, maybe. Your career, however, are you one of those people who always had novels inside you waiting to come out? Did you think you'd be a writer?
No, never ever occurred to me, and absolutely probably the furthest thing from my mind that I could think of. I think I was more likely to become an accountant or a lawyer. The strange thing for me I had a passion for English and for for reading and novels almost up until I went to Oxford. You know, at school as a teenager, you know, it was the great escape from not a particularly thrilling, you know, I grew up in a very ordinary town in Kent. You know, as I say, until 17 I hadn't left, you know, the country. So quite an ordinary childhood from which I escaped with reading. And for some reason, I found the process of studying English as we did it at Oxford very almost destructive. You know, you were always analysing and pulling apart and questioning, you know, things that a writer had done 400 years ago. And I found it over analytical. It didn't give you any pleasure. You dissected it so much that the actual thing you were reading almost became like a specimen that you were dissecting, you know, on a petri dish. So I didn't come away at all still with that passion. It didn't encourage you to write creatively, because you'd be too analytical about what you were writing, because of this sort of 3 years of, you know, chopping poems and novels and plays into small pieces. So no, it was not at all in my mind. And I sort of realise now that quite a big influence, and it's a very, you know, I think viewers will be interested. We're very good friends of Jill and Robert Harris. Robert Harris, the astonishingly brilliant novelist, and we used to go on holiday with them, you know, every year. And I remember going to Pompeii with Robert and Jill, I think we had our children by then, and knowing that as he was walking around Pompeii, something had happened to him. Like, you know, this is where he had the idea for his great novel Pompeii. And I remember that at that moment thinking, gosh, wouldn't that be nice to be on holiday and to have that light bulb moment? So then when I had the idea in Spinalonga, you know, we went for the day on holiday. Actually, not even for a day. It takes a couple of hours to go on a trip there. And I had this idea that came very suddenly, really suddenly, that for the first time made me want to write a fictional story. And one of the things that kind of was in my head, this little voice of doubt, was, don't be ridiculous. You know, you can't write a story. How old? I think I was 43, 44, maybe 45 by then. And I thought, can you imagine this is my voice of doubt. Can you imagine the next time you see Robert Harris, your friend, and you say, oh, I'm writing a novel? I mean, it just seemed absurd. It really did seem absurd. But this idea that I had, purely that came within the hour that we were walking around, it wouldn't let me go. It was like,
now, you know, what we're talking about now is the inspiration for your first book, your debut book, which is, of course, The Island. And so, I mean, Robert Harris, actually, I spoke to him a few weeks ago here on Viking.TV, and he was saying exactly what you said, what you need a great setting. And you need to be inspired then to find a story to tell within that setting. And clearly, when you discovered this island, Spinalonga, which you hopefully will tell us about now, that became the inspiration for the setting, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Tell us about Spinalonga, though. Where is it? What is it?
Okay, absolutely. It's, you know, I live and breathe this little place every day of my life, and of course some people haven't heard of it. Why should they? It's a tiny little island that does, if you imagine a slow walk, here it is, it's a beautiful photograph of it, a walk round the circumference of Spinalonga in the heat, quite slowly, gentle pace. It takes an hour. So it's situated 500 meters from the coast of Crete, opposite a village called Plaka. And as you can see from this beautiful photograph, you can see here the Venetian, that round wall is the Venetian castle, because at one point it was when Crete was occupied by the Venetians, it was a fortress. And then during the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish period, it was a settlement where the Turkish, you know, families built houses and lived. And from 1903, the kind of third big chapter of Spinalonga's life, it became an isolation hospital for people with leprosy. And the reason that people were sent there was because of a very specific discovery about leprosy that had happened in 1898, when for the first time a biologist saw the leprosy bacteria under the microscope. And so at that point, having seen there was a bacteria, they knew that this bacteria could be transferred. And that was when leprosaria, leprosy hospitals, leper colonies, they're often called different things, when there was a sort of official instruction from governments all around the world that if somebody had leprosy, they had to be isolated and put in a hospital, an island, somewhere away from their families. And little tiny Spinalonga was the ideal location for a leprosy hospital in terms of, you know, the thinking about the treatment.
So did you go there yourself and explore it and learn its history?
Yes, I mean, I saw it's in the guidebooks. It has been for, you know, 20 or 30 years, and boats have taken people across to have a look around. And it just said Spinalonga, small island, Venetian castle, Turkish ruins, former leper colony. And I thought, well, that's different from a Minoan, because in Crete there are a lot of fantastic Minoan remains, but we had our children with us, obviously. They were 8 and 10 years old, and to be honest, a lot of archaeological sites require a lot of imagination to think, oh, there used to be a palace. You've got to add the walls yourself. Whereas Spinalonga, as you can see from these images, it's like a little Greek village. And literally I knew nothing. We stepped off the boat and found ourselves walking through these little streets on Spinalonga. And it absolutely captivated me, because it felt as though the people who had lived there had just gone out. You know, they had popped out for the afternoon somewhere, but you could still feel their presence, because it shut in 1957. That's when the cure for leprosy was discovered. So all the patients were allowed to leave. So, you know, I was born in 1959. So I felt 1957. My sister was born in 1957. So I thought, God, that was when, more or less, when we were born. This is history that is still warm. But such a different universe to have lived there and been, you know, gone there on a one-way journey.
Of course, I mean, when we talk about leprosy, we still have the phrase in our own language, don't we, that you treat somebody like a leper means that you isolate them, you don't have anything to do with them. So the people who went to Spinalonga, were they, I mean, was it a dark, dismal, terrible place for them, or did they make it a community?
Well, at the very beginning, when it was set up as the place where, and it was a government law here that, you know, you had to go, it wasn't an option. And so it was like a prison, you know, it was a prison, you couldn't leave. And they actually had guards there to stop people leaving. And because you could swim, if you were a strong enough swimmer, you could escape. And at the first 20 or 30 years, when they were more or less kind of abandoned to their own fate, it was a terrible place. And there was a young lawyer with leprosy who came from Athens. You know, he was brought there to live, theoretically forever. And he was a great campaigner for the human rights of the people of Spinalonga. And somehow, you know, this big charismatic personality, and there's a picture of him on Spinalonga now in the little museum, and he was a really powerful personality, and he managed to persuade the government to improve, you know, supplies, food, you know, fresh water, and he made things much better. And they built, you know, better accommodation, improved the hospital, you know, so many improvements happened, mostly during the 40s, after the arrival of this wonderful man who was called Remondikis. So it had been, you know, what we call a hellhole. I think it was a terrible, terrible place. But towards the end, it became, you know, a really much stronger and I'm not saying happier community, because that's me kind of imagining perhaps things to be better than they were. But there was more care between, you know, the patients themselves and better conditions. So, but nevertheless, until 1950, they had, you know, no hope of a cure. There was no treatment for these people. They literally just sat in Spinalonga, you know, waiting for leprosy to worsen. So yeah, it was a terrible thing.
When you went there and you were walking around there with your family and drinking in this history, did you get that sort of pinch me moment where you thought, wow, I've actually discovered something here that does excite me and that you could write about?
Yes, I definitely felt that there was a story waiting to be told. Definitely felt that way. And there's something that Stephen King, you know, the great thriller writer, he's written this wonderful book called On Writing, and it's a kind of autobiographical book about how he writes. And for me, it's a Bible, this little book. And one of the things that he says is that when you're writing, you feel, or when he's writing, and I've felt this myself, you're almost digging something up. You're like an archaeologist scraping away layers and pulling something out of the ground that was already there. And it's a strange feeling to have, and I've had it with all the books that I've written, that I'm almost like the old man who in my story, who digs up Aphrodite, that the story is, you haven't really made it up. It's there, waiting just for you. Yeah, and I felt that.
It's funny to talk about that in front of the sculpture. Well, I know she was built, but apparently sculptors say that. They say they're releasing something when they start chipping away at a block. They're not creating, they're actually releasing something. So maybe that's what you were doing. And I mean, people who've read The Island love The Island, and I know it's been absolutely huge for you. Talk about that in a moment, but just a bit more on the leprosy thing, because all that knowledge has stuck with you. You work now with the leprosy charity Lepra, don't you?
Yes, Lepra is a very well established charity that's been fundraising for treatment for leprosy patients around the world for decades now. And probably some viewers will remember the Blue Peter appeal that happened, I think, about 20 years ago, where they raised so much money. There's now a Blue Peter Centre for leprosy patients out in India, and they train doctors and case finding people with leprosy in India, Bangladesh, some parts of South America is still it's a task that has to be done, because there's still a stigma attached to leprosy, which is a kind of madness, really, because there's a cure, and it's not a curse from God or something that you get because you're punished. It's literally, you know, it's something that if I had it and somebody came to my house, I might just inadvertently pass it to them. I mean, it's just an infectious disease. So Lepra still tirelessly, work to find people with leprosy in these usually quite rural communities in India. And there are 300,000 new cases a year still in the world. So if they're not found, the thing with leprosy, once you're treating it, it's a month or so until it stops being, the bacteria are killed off. Whereas if you allow it to develop, then you get these sort of malformations of the face and the hands and the feet that are totally life-changing. So it's a really worthwhile thing to find people when it's at the early stages and cure them for the rest of their lives.
My goodness, that discovery of that island really did change your life, didn't it?
And
I know, I mean, the island was so successful that you got Hollywood filmmakers coming after it, but you actually turned them down at Hollywood, didn't you?
I did. Yes, I did, because I was very nervous. Even nervous isn't a big enough word, actually. I was very determined that the leprosy patients should not be portrayed as monsters, and it would have been a story where it would have been easy to show them, as kind of ghoulishly ugly. And by that time, I'd met someone here in Crete who was an ex-leprosy patient, and he was just the most beautiful man I knew, and he had very I always saw him as very handsome, but he had, a lot of the characteristic facial changes, let's call them, from leprosy. He was 80 years old, and he had these huge distended ears. He more or less had no nose because it had eaten away at the cartilage. That's one of the things that happens. He had no hair at all because there he is. Oh gosh.
Yes.
Well, I'm describing Manoli.
And that's you.
And that's me.
You're both in costume for the filming.
That's right. We both played together as leprosy patients in the TV series that we eventually made for Greek.TV of the island. And actually you can see his hands, so it has huge effect on the body. But at the same time, this man was the funniest, kindest, wisest, most adorably charismatic man probably that I've ever met. So if a Hollywood producer comes to me, who's made horror films, specifically this chap, and I just say, well, it's really nice that you're interested, but no, thank you. So that wasn't difficult.
So you did approve then of the Greek TV series, which I gather was 26 parts, 26 and that's been hugely successful. And you did obviously manage to get your way onto the set and even as an extra.
Absolutely, and with Manoli. So we had this, astonishingly moving moment where, life and art, just you didn't know where one began and the other ended, because he was sort of reliving a real situation for himself. And the whole cast and crew, we all worshipped this man, Manoli. We really did. You know, he became part of everybody's hearts. Yeah, and I talk about him in the past because just after he made that scene, because he'd lost one of his lungs through leprosy, just after we made that scene, he became ill, and he died just as we were finishing filming. But he was ready. You know, I remember I went to see him a lot in hospital. He was 86 years old. You know, he'd survived a disease which had, you know, done terrible things to his body, but he is always very brave. And he was very, very religious man. You probably in that picture, he's actually holding his icon that he brought from his house. And he said, I'm ready. And off he went. So the whole, you know, the series was dedicated to him, in fact. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And who was there?
Well, I mean, they are identical twin brothers, because you think, is that a, you know, some kind of clever mirror image? And again, you know, we had the cooperation and support of every single person in our local town and in Plaka, the little place opposite Spinalonga, for the whole of the production. People were queuing up to play as extras. You know, we could see, you know, if we wanted authentic Greek, you know, Cretan villagers, we just had them there. They didn't even need a costume change. So we had a lot of love and support from, you know, everyone in the area, and it was a great, almost like a community project, really. So it was rather wonderful. Yeah. Really a great time.
Sometimes when authors sell the rights to a film company, they're not allowed anywhere near the production, but you were script editing for it as well, and obviously you got onto set. And I think I've seen you describe yourself as rather more controlling an author than many.
Yes, it's actually written into my contracts for these things that, you know, I have script approval, casting approval over them, who writes the music. No, I'm more of a control freak about that than almost anything else. I mean, Ian might disagree with that, but I really do feel that if you lose control over if you don't love a book that you've written, I think you could just give it away. Bye, don't want to know. But I do pour a lot of my heart and soul into what I write. And it would be like someone, like, you know, taking your baby and just, you know, not being kind to it. So I really like to nurture and to still be involved. And I don't say no to everything that's suggested when things are changed, because sometimes script writers have incredible, brilliant ideas, and I'll go, wow, I wish I'd thought of that. You know, so it doesn't make me I don't think it makes me a nightmare. I think it makes me support.
Well, today is the day that they're bringing out One August Night in paperback, I gather. So congratulations on that. Now, One August Night it revisits the island, yes?
It does, absolutely. When I finish the island, the kind of climax of that book is the night when everyone leaves Spinalonga, because the cure has been found, and it's this big celebration, a sort of moment that everybody's been waiting for decades. Yeah. And on the same night there is a murder, and the two are connected. You know, one happens really because something, you know, it's like a butterfly flapping its wings, that the return of all the leprosy patients is going to be a problem for one of the characters, and a murder takes place. So this lovely evening turns into the terrible night, the One August night. So that happened in the island, and some of the characters in the island, one in particular, just vanishes from the story because he runs away. And during the period of lockdown last year, when we were, not in a situation so dissimilar, with an incurable disease that demanded isolation and so on and so forth, my mind went back to Spinalonga, and I thought, I wonder what happened to some of those characters. I want to go into more depth and to find actually catharsis for one of them in particular. So I spent that period of lockdown writing One August Night, which picks up again with most of the main characters from the island. Yeah.
And it's fascinating because I know so many readers have such an affinity with the island. They love it so much. And you must get letters from them saying why they love it so much. So to be able to revisit it and almost sort of a closing, get some sort of a closure on it, I guess. What do your readers say to you?
Well, they haven't been annoyed with me for going back and revisiting. I haven't had any, people really seem to be glad to have a resume. Perhaps they also felt that I kind of raced. There was a kind of race for me at the end with the island, because I think the last sort of 30 or 40 pages I cover, 50 years, having taken 350 pages to do a 10-year period. So I think, generally people were very, keen to see what happened next, although it was not something I'd ever intended to do. I really hadn't always had it in my mind. It was, as I think ideally books should be, it is that moment of inspiration where you can't not write something. I think that's how I feel about writing. It's something I really feel I've got to do.
Yeah, but you take your research very seriously, which is, I suppose your readers say, why the books, when you read them, feel so authentic. To the extent that you felt in the end, didn't you, that you really ought to learn the language if you want to be able to talk to the locals, not just research books, but talk to the locals, who after all are the human beings who have the stories. How difficult was it to learn to speak Greek?
Gosh, I'd say very. In the last, I started, let's say, gosh, it's probably 8 years ago now. And I think that if I hadn't been learning Greek, I probably would have written eight more books, because it's actually taken a lot of brain space and time, because the alphabet is obviously the first step. And that probably was the hardest thing, looking at Greek words and not having to work them out almost mathematically. So what's that sound? In a way, as a child learns to read, you have to go right back to being, a 4-year-old if you imagine looking at letters as a 4-year-old for the first time. We're all so familiar with them now, we don't even notice them as letters, but you have to go back to that very childlike stage. And then you suddenly realize you've stopped doing that you are seeing words, and then so on, and it just kind of develops exponentially. And it is very exciting to talk to people and not have that barrier of language, particularly elderly people, because I'd say 80% of young people in Greece, they've learnt some English at school and they can all communicate, particularly in touristic places. It's an economic need. But older people, anyone of 60 and above, people in villages, there is, to me, nothing more important than to chat, to make time to chat to some elderly people, and to hear. Yeah, I mean, it's mutually, I just feel, I've always feel I've got all the time in the world if I'm with somebody of that generation. And there's an amazing kind of kindness about all Greeks in terms of my experience of them anyway. But, elderly people, they'll always, you'll sit down with them and they'll bring you something to eat and drink and have a little chat. So the language is just, it's almost like oxygen for me here. I'd feel like I was in a box and now my box is kind of
The lid.
fallen, the lids come off, and I feel, no, language is, and it's good for the brain as well. You know, that's the other thing with learning a language. I think the neurologists are always telling us it's very good to keep certain things in your brain slightly firing a bit faster than they might otherwise. So I thoroughly recommend it.
It's a lovely picture of you with your friend Soso, I think.
Oh yes, Soso. She is Manoli's sister-in-law.
Oh.
A wonderful, wonderful woman. Again, I mean, that's a typical situation. Popped round to say hello to her, and then little bits of food suddenly appear right in front of you. And she's a wonderful, hospitable, kind, lovely person, and her husband was Manoli's brother. And you know, we used to, when Manoli was alive and the brother Yorgos was alive, and we'd spend a lot of time down at those windmills, which are near Ilunda. Those are literally next to Spinalonga, and they'd I think had in their family for decades this old ancient windmill down there that they used to go and sleep in on summer nights. So very magical times.
Got a lovely picture of you with Spinalonga in the background. And I was interested in this photograph simply because we need to explain to everybody just how incredibly important your books have been to tourism. So much so that, as I said earlier, the president decided to give you citizenship.
Wasn't that kind of him? Really kind. It kind of came out of the blue last summer. You know, a very difficult year for everybody, wasn't it? Really, just the most, you know, a year of quite extreme, you know, challenges for us all. And my mother had died in March, which had been, you know, a shock to our family. So it had been a pretty bad year. And in July, one very hot, it was one of those lovely heat wave days that we had in July, I had a call on my mobile, an unknown number, as you know, because quite often when you get an unknown number, I don't always answer on an unknown number. So the unknown, but it was a Greek unknown number, so I did answer it, and it was actually somebody from the foreign ministry, and he asked some very strange questions. He said, "Oh, I need to know your father's name and date of birth and where you were born," and it kind of alerted me to the fact something was going on, that they were preparing some kind of identity papers or something. So I gave him, and he said, "Oh, and I need to give your number to the Prime Minister." And I said, "Oh, great, lovely." So I sat there for the next 20, and I couldn't say why, what exactly. I didn't want to ask too many questions. So I sat there in a state of kind of tension and excitement and agitation. I couldn't eat for 24 hours because I thought the Prime Minister is going to ring me. And then, you know, a few hours of the next day went by and I was thinking, oh, he's not, you know, it was just like that state that you get into when you're nervous. And then suddenly I saw another Greek number on my phone. I had my phone in my hand, you know, all day, and it was the Prime Minister, whose voice I recognised because, you know, I've listened to him on the radio and he's always on the television, and so I knew he's got a very, very distinctive voice, very rich, beautiful, the best kind of lovely Greek, lovely voice. And there he was, and you know, that's where I thought, I know he speaks, he's very highly educated person and speaks perfect English, but for the first 5 minutes we chatted in Greek, and you know, I understood that he was offering me citizenship. So you know, I was pretty speechless. I didn't really know what you meant to say to such a lovely gift. You know, I was just like, well, you know, thank you. Saying thank you. I don't think I said much else, to be honest. And then 6 weeks later, I went to Athens and swore my oath at the Foreign Ministry, and then I went to meet Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and then met the president, who's this wonderful woman. They have a female president for the first time, which was very thrilling. It's a very good thing for Greece. And a month later, I actually got my physical passport and my identity card, which everybody has here. So, gosh, yes, I mean, what a wonderful gift, really, a gift of the best kind. And yeah, they're my most treasured possessions, really. My parcel, I should have them with me to show you.
Yes. Yeah, but that is so meaningful, isn't it? It's and it really does show how a writer can make that much of a difference. I mean, I used the phrase earlier, and I think he used something like it, didn't he, or she did, that you had sort of put modern Greece back on the map.
Yes, I think there's so much done with the stories of ancient Greece and the mythologies and so on, and you know, really beautifully done. You know, we've all loved Stephen Fry's mythos and, you know, all the books that he's done, but that's tended to be a focus of British writers. We love the archaeology and things that happened thousands of years ago, but modern Greece has been it's been written about. I'm not the only one, but it hasn't been perhaps as made easily accessible as perhaps, you know, I write fairly simply. I mean, I don't write literary books. I think of them as stories. You know, I write as I speak. You know, there's nothing tricky about them, I don't think, at all. And interestingly, my novel before One August Night was Those Who Are Loved, which dealt with the Greek Civil War. And even as I was writing that book, I thought this might be the end of the Greek love affair with me. They might hate me after this because it's a totally taboo subject. You know, civil wars leave a lot of bitterness behind, just as the Spanish Civil War did. And the Greek Civil War they haven't dealt with it. They haven't really had their cleansing from it. And you know, it was something I couldn't not write about. I went to a place that was a prison camp during the Civil War, and I thought I can't not write about this. So I sort of put my fingers in an electric socket. That's what it felt like, and wrote Those Who Are Loved. And I was anxious, and then when it came out, you know, and realised that, you know, a lot of Greek people, when it was translated into Greek, a lot of Greek people were saying, you know, thank you for writing about that, because you've written about something that many Greeks are too afraid to write about. Yes. And we now know things about our own civil war that you've presented to us. So it's a funny thing. I've maybe brought some stories to readers in other countries, but I've also brought things to Greece, because actually Spinalonga itself was always regarded as a shameful. It was like a blot on the landscape, and they hadn't ever given it a human story, a human side. So
maybe by giving it that human story, you have made it beautiful again. It's a question that crops up again and again. We've got lots of questions coming in. Andrea in London says, why do you always set your stories against Greece in turmoil?
Good question. Because Greece has generally, there's been so many periods of turmoil that actually, if you're writing about modern Greece, when I say modern, I mean sort of, for me, modern is 20th century, you know, modern as opposed to ancient. And modern, the sort of state of modern Greece was actually only created in 1821, because this is the anniversary of the Greek Revolution against the Ottomans. But for me, really, modern Greece is any time from 1922 onwards, because that was another moment of upheaval in Greek history. So if I'm going to write about Greek 20th century, I don't know where to find a period or a decade where there isn't turmoil. You know, they had this population exchange in the 20s. There was a dictatorship in the 30s. There was occupation in the 40s and civil war, which had a very long tail of, let's say, bitterness and aftermath, with people in prison as a result of that civil war, right up until and then there's the junta, 60s to 70s, another dictator. So where would I find a moment which is turmoil? And actually, all of my books, without exception, as I kind of look at them on the shelf over there, even the ones set in Spain, the ones set in Cyprus, all of them are about how people survive turmoil, how people actually live during turmoil and come out of it and rebuild lives. So it's a good word for Andrea to use, because it's true. It's totally true.
Well, lots of other questions. Edith in Portishead, that's near Bristol, isn't it, in the UK? Do your children write, or have they gone into totally different professions from you and your husband?
Oh, alas, our genes seem very strong. I'd love to say, my son's a doctor, my daughter's a lawyer, but they're both writers. And so, and I'm very, of course, I'm happy about that, but it's really, the genes are pretty strong with them. Our daughter's, gosh, a fantastic writer. She's a journalist, and she actually lives in South America at the moment. She's writing about culture and life there. And our son is a comedian and writer. So what do I say?
You can't help you. Like you said, genes are strong. We all want children to be doctors and lawyers, don't we? Because they'd be so useful, but they don't.
Actually, said that our daughter is a lawyer. She did a law degree and then decided to become a writer.
Yeah. I've got one of those. They do that nowadays, don't they? They spend a fortune getting degrees in something and then completely ignore what they've just been trained in.
Yeah.
Charles and Samantha in New York say, where do you write? How do you write? And doesn't it ever get too hot to write?
Yeah, lovely. Well, fortunately, we live in the days of air conditioning, so that's the answer to the heat. I write sort of wherever I am, really. I write on a laptop, so I'm never restricted by, needing to be in a certain place. So if I'm in London, I write in a library. I'm in the London Library, which is a beautiful haven of tranquility, full of mad people like me who write, but we're all there together. So that's a great place. And I write a lot when I'm in Crete, which is probably my most inspirational or inspired place to write. And I tend to write, answer to how I write, I think what they mean by that, do I just write when I feel like it? And the answer is no. I write at certain times of day, and the kind of magical thing sometimes about writing is if you actually sit and you hold a pencil or you open your laptop, something comes. I don't wait until I feel so inspired, I must go and do some writing. I sit there and know that something will come because my bottom is on a chair. If my bottom isn't on the chair, I never do any writing.
Something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here, this is a good one. Ben in the US says, how do you celebrate when you finish a book?
Very easy question, an easy answer. I have because you always finish in the evening, don't you? You would never finish a book in the morning. It just wouldn't happen. So it would be a cold glass of wine, or a glass of cold white wine or champagne. But then you have to be with other people.
Yeah. Because how do you know you've finished? Because I presume, unless the publishers are saying I must have it by 5 o'clock this evening, how do you know when you've finished? Because you could always do something a little extra, couldn't you?
Somehow you always just know when it's almost like, I think probably like writing a piece of music where there's a cadence at the end. It just feels like it's resolved. And obviously there's always that time when you finish the first draft, which is the moment, that's the cold white wine moment, when you feel that you've completed it. But then, of course, you go through the process of getting comments from an editor, in my case from our daughter Emily, who's my first reader. And that's when I go, oh, I hadn't finished it at all. I thought it was finished, but there's so much more to be done. So you often have a second finish. But the very first time that you feel you've finished is the lovely sense of relief, because most of the story will be there by then. But then the kind of slightly more tricky work when someone says, well, you know, one of your characters seems to have been pregnant for 2 years. You need something about that. You know, there's always things that a very clever reader, like the editor, Flora, who's been my editor my whole career as a writer, and my daughter, Emily and Flora between them will, you know, give me lots of work to do to create the second, what's actually really then delivered to the reader.
So, I mean, I said earlier you're married to Ian, who's the editor of Private Eye, very well-known broadcaster in Britain. Is he your greatest critic, or won't you let him anywhere near your books until they're almost on the shelves?
I don't let him anywhere near for a long time. Mischievous look, because, and I, you know, this isn't me being self-deprecating at all. It's just a fact. He's much cleverer than I am, and he's an editor. You know, he edits a magazine, and he's doing that now for, you know, ever since we left university. You know, he got a better degree than me at university, which doesn't rankle because I accept, you know, academically he was a notch above me, and you know, his whole work every day, all day, is scrutinizing copy, making it better, and I can't have him involved in my process of doing that, because we wouldn't still be married, and what's worth more. So he sees it at a very, very, very almost too late stage to change anything, but not quite too late. So yeah, he sees it when Emily's done the work, when Flora's done the work, when it's usually at its second, if not third draft stage. And then he will always deliver something fantastically helpful and useful. It's usually at a very good stage by then, and I certainly wouldn't say it's sorry, you're too late. I would say you're allowed just one or two tiny things, and that's what he gives me.
That's perfect. Anna in London says, oh, how did you and Ian meet? You've already, but she adds, do you ever write for Private Eye?
No.
Steer clear. And well, one more from Maria in Cleveland. How many unoccupied islands are there around Greece? And have you explored any others like Spinalonga?
That's a fascinating question. There are said to be hundreds of tiny unoccupied islands, and there are some now which have such a tiny population. You know, they might have a dozen or so, you know, full-time residents. So there are still a lot. I'm not a great sailor, unfortunately. I get very seasick. I mean, in my fantasy, I would go on a journey where I visited all such places. You know, quite often the sea is a little bit too much for me to do, but I have visited now 45 different Greek islands, and some of them are extremely small. I mean, really tiny, but they all have a little population. But I mean, I think they've all been discovered. But if she's a good sailor, she could, you know, really go on a tour and perhaps name one after herself. It's probably not too late.
Maybe discover something amazing for herself and write a book about it. What are you working on at the moment? Have you got another book in the offing?
Well, I haven't really got going on the next one, but because I literally last week we finished the filming with Aphrodite here behind me, which is a 12-part adaptation of this book, Carp Postal,
yeah.
and that's for the Greek national channel. But we're hoping that will be shown more broadly. So working on the script writers for that was, you know, again, quite an intensive creative task. So hopefully next week, now the cast and the crew have all gone their different ways and we've packed everything up and some of the props have arrived at my house, I've got a bit more chance to get going again.
What will you be doing now today as I love and leave you? Beautiful food, beautiful Greek food.
Oh yes, it'd probably be for lunch. It tends to be a Greek salad, which, you know, you can do in many different ways, and I could do 100 Greek salad recipes, you know, whether or not you include capers, for example, you know, that can really change the flavour of a Greek salad. And what kind of olives, you know, there are so many different types and textures of olive. You know, feta cheese, even that comes in many different kind of degrees of strength. So yes, I could really do a different Greek salad every day, you know, and people don't say, oh, not Greek salad again, because it isn't always the same. So that's what I'll be doing when we've stopped chatting.
It sounds like the perfect lifestyle. It really does. I envy you hugely. We're getting very good weather here in Britain at the moment, but it's nothing like the setting that you've got there. A very inspirational setting as well. Hopefully it will go on and inspire you to more books. Although I don't want to work you too hard. You've written enough, haven't you? But for the moment, let me just say thank you. It's just been so fascinating to talk to you. And it has been a glimpse into another world, a beautiful world.
It is. Well, thank you. It's been lovely talking to you, and hello to all the viewers as well.
Absolutely. Well, they all want to come and see, and maybe not you yourself, but have a look around as things open up and the cruises get going. Greece and its beautiful islands will be more available to us. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you. Thanks
have
to everyone.
Have a wonderful rest of the time there until you come back to London. But yeah, have a wonderful day too. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And here on Viking TV, I won't be with you next week because we've got a special Highclere week next week. In the company of Lord and Lady Carnarvon, we'll be finding out more about Highclere Castle, the home of the real Downton Abbey. But I'll be with you the week after with lots more exciting, wonderful people to meet. We've got lots of really interesting people lined up for you as the coming weeks go forth. So from me and Diamond, have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to Victoria Hislop too.